Eleanor Whitfield did not weep when the third man turned his back on her. She stood in the middle of that sun-beaten Wyoming street, suitcase at her feet, her mother's necklace burning against her throat, every soul in Dust Creek watching, and she lifted her chin. 3 men. 3 promises. 3 rejections. All within the span of 15 minutes. And not one of them had the decency to lower his voice. She was 25 years old. She had nothing left. And she had just become the most talked-about woman in a town that had never once met her. If this story already has you feeling something, I want you to know, it only gets deeper from here. Please subscribe to this channel and follow Eleanor's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love knowing how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. The stagecoach from Cheyenne arrived in Dust Creek at 10:30 on a Tuesday morning in July of 1885, and Eleanor Whitfield was the last passenger to step down. She had been awake for most of the 3-day journey. Not because the road was rough, though it was, and not because the heat was unbearable, though it was that too. She had been awake because she was terrified, and she had long since learned that terror was something you outlasted by keeping your eyes open. She smoothed the front of her traveling dress before she touched the ground. She had pressed it the night before at the last way station, using a flat iron she had borrowed from a woman who hadn't asked why Eleanor needed it so badly at that hour. She had pinned her dark hair up neatly. She had cleaned the dust from her boots as best she could. She had done everything in her power to make herself look like a woman worth choosing. She stepped off that coach carrying one suitcase, her late mother's pearl necklace at her throat, and the last remnants of something she had almost stopped calling hope. Boston felt like a different world. A smaller one somehow, even though it was a city. The years she had spent there, after her parents died. First her father to a mill accident, then her mother to a sickness that crept in slowly and took everything before it left, had compressed her life down to something narrow and exhausting. Seamstress work. A rented room. The kind of loneliness that doesn't announce itself, but simply settles into your bones, until one morning you wake up and realize you can't remember the last time someone said your name like it meant something. She had answered 4 advertisements in the matrimonial news. 4 men looking for wives in the territories. Men who described themselves as hard-working and honest, and in need of a good woman to build a life alongside. One man had stopped writing before she even purchased her ticket. 3 had confirmed they would meet her in Dust Creek. She stood on that street and saw them immediately. A cluster of men near the general store, all of them looking toward the stagecoach with varying degrees of anticipation on their faces. For just a moment, the bright specific moment before any of them moved, Eleanor allowed herself to feel it. That small, fragile thing she had carried across 2,000 miles. The possibility that this was the beginning of something. That she had finally, after all of it, found her way to somewhere she might belong. Then the first man walked toward her. Samuel Carter was prosperous-looking in a way that made Eleanor immediately aware of how little she had. He wore a good coat. He had the broad, settled confidence of a man who owned things and expected the world to accommodate him. He looked at Eleanor the way a merchant examines merchandise, not unkindly exactly, but with a calculating precision that had nothing to do with kindness. He stopped a few feet from her. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Mr. Carter," she answered. He looked at her for a long moment. Not her face, or not only her face. All of her. Her dress. Her single suitcase. The lines around her eyes that her mother's illness and years of close needlework had put there before she was 23. He cleared his throat. "I had understood from your letters that you were somewhat younger." Eleanor felt the words before she fully processed them. They landed in her chest like something dropped from a height. "I am 25, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she deserved credit for. "Yes." Samuel Carter looked briefly toward the other men, as though seeking something, permission perhaps, or corroboration. "I had hoped for someone a bit more delicate, in constitution. I'm sure you understand." "I'm not certain I do," Eleanor said. He did not appear to hear her. Or perhaps he simply chose not to. He touched the brim of his hat, murmured something that might have been an apology, and walked away. The whole town watched him go. Eleanor did not move. The second man came forward almost immediately. Thomas Reed, who owned a cattle operation several miles from town and had written Eleanor letters that were blunt but not unkind. He was a big man, red-faced from weather, and he looked at her with something closer to genuine regret than Carter had managed. He looked at her hands. He actually reached out and lifted one of her hands by the wrist, not roughly, but without asking, turning it over to examine her palm, the way a man checks a horse's hoof at auction. Eleanor went very still. "Your hands are small," he said. "They are my hands," Eleanor replied. "Ranch work is hard." He released her. "I need a woman who can manage it, someone with more physical—" He shook his head. "I'm sorry, Miss Whitfield. I don't think you're suited to what I need." "You don't know anything about what I'm suited for," Eleanor said. He had the grace to look uncomfortable, but he still turned and walked away. 2 men down. The whispers from the boardwalk had already started. Eleanor could hear individual words pulling free from the murmur. "All that way. Can't blame a man for knowing what he wants. Poor thing." She hated the poor thing most of all. Caleb Morris was the last one. He was younger than the other two, with the earnest, unfinished look of a man who had not yet decided what kind of person he intended to become. He had written Eleanor the longest letters. He had asked about her reading habits. He had told her he respected education in a woman. He stood in front of her now with his hat in his hands and something that looked like genuine distress on his face. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "I want you to know I read all your letters more than once." "I remember writing them," Eleanor said. You're not what I pictured." "And what did you picture, Mr. Morris?" "Someone more." He searched for the word, struggled with it. "Someone more like the women here, who knows the land, who fits." "I can learn land," Eleanor said. "I have learned harder things." "You're too educated," he said finally, and the absurdity of it, the sheer spectacular absurdity of being rejected for knowing too much, struck Eleanor somewhere between her ribs and did something complicated to her face that she worked very hard to control. "You'd be unhappy here. I think we'd never work. I'm sorry." He put his hat back on his head. He walked away. All 3 of them gone within 15 minutes of her stepping off the stagecoach. Eleanor stood in the middle of the street in Dust Creek, Wyoming, with her suitcase beside her, and the whole town watching, and she did not cry. She wanted to. The want of it pressed behind her eyes with a physical force that surprised her. She had cried in the weeks after her mother died, cried quietly and thoroughly in the rented room in Boston, cried the way a person cries when they are certain no one will come if they call out. She knew how to cry without making a sound. She had practice. But she would not do it here. Not in this street. Not with these people watching and whispering and shaking their heads. She picked up her suitcase. She turned and walked down the main street of Dust Creek without looking at anyone, and she found the boarding house by reading the sign on the door. Dolan's rooms 3 cents a night, and she went inside and paid for one night and asked if there was a room at the back away from the street. There was. She took it. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in that small room and put her suitcase across her knees and opened it and looked at what she had. 2 dresses, a Bible that had been her mother's, a small leather wallet containing $4.62, a packet of sewing needles and 2 spools of thread, a photograph of her parents taken in 1871, the year before everything started going wrong. She looked at her mother's face in that photograph for a long time. Then she closed the suitcase, set it on the floor, lay down on top of the thin coverlet, and stared at the ceiling. She was 25 years old. She was in Wyoming. She had $4.62. She had no husband, no family, no position, no plan. And she was not going to spend what remained of this day feeling sorry for herself. She was going to think. Eleanor Whitfield had been thinking her way through problems since she was 9 years old, and understood for the first time that her father's wages at the mill were not sufficient, and that understanding numbers was going to matter more than anyone had told her it would. She had taught herself bookkeeping from a library copy of a merchant's manual. She had managed her mother's medical accounts while simultaneously working 12-hour days at the seamstress shop. She was capable. She had always been capable in ways that no one had ever once thought to notice or reward, she thought now. She could take the next stagecoach back to Cheyenne. From Cheyenne, she could potentially get work. There were hotels, laundries, seamstress operations. She had enough money for a ticket and a few nights' accommodation if she was careful. She could go back to something that looked more or less like the life she had left. Or she could stay. She did not know yet what staying would mean, practically speaking. She had no connections in Dust Creek. She had made the worst possible first impression, or rather, the town's first impression of her had been formed entirely by 3 men who had looked at her and found her wanting, which was not the same thing at all, but felt like it in the moment. But she had $4.62 a sewing kit, and the ability to do things most people could not do, and she was not ready to admit that the West had beaten her. Not yet. She fell asleep before she meant to, and woke in the early evening to the sound of voices from the street outside. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling was wrong. The light was wrong. Then she remembered all of it in a single efficient rush and lay still breathing, letting it settle back into place. She got up, washed her face from the basin on the dresser, repinned her hair. She went downstairs and asked Mrs. Dolan, the boarding house proprietor, a small compact woman with suspicious eyes, whether there was any work to be had in town. Sewing, bookkeeping, anything. Mrs. Dolan looked her up and down with the frank assessment of a woman who had seen a great many situations walk through her door. "You're the bride from the stage," she said, not unkindly, just stating it. "I am the woman who arrived on the stage," Eleanor said. "Whether I'm a bride is apparently still being decided." Something shifted in Mrs. Dolan's expression. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to respect. "I'll ask around," she said. "Come back in the morning." Eleanor ate a modest supper bread and some kind of stew, which she paid for separately from the room, and then she went back upstairs and sat by the narrow window and looked at the street below. Dust Creek was not impressive. It had the raw, unfinished look of a town that hadn't yet decided whether it intended to survive. The main street was unpaved, deep-rutted from wagon traffic lined with wooden storefronts that all looked like they'd been built in a hurry. A saloon, a general store, a bank, a small church at the far end with a cross that leaned slightly to the left. But there were also gardens she could see from her window. Kitchen gardens running alongside the houses. Children running in the early evening light. The smell of something cooking that drifted up from several directions at once. It was in its rough and unfinished way, a place where people were trying to make something. She could respect that. She sat there watching the street until the light was nearly gone, and at some point she became aware that a man was standing on the boardwalk across from the boarding house, not doing anything particular, just standing with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his hat pulled low against the evening light. And she had the distinct impression, though she couldn't have said why, that he was looking up at her window. She moved back from the glass. She told herself it was nothing. A man standing on a boardwalk was not unusual. She was being oversensitive, reading significance into ordinary things, because the day had stripped her down to nerve endings. She got ready for bed and she slept, and if she dreamed, she did not remember it in the morning. The note was under her door when she woke. She almost stepped on it. A folded piece of paper, plain, no seal. She picked it up and unfolded it, standing there in her stocking feet on the bare floorboards. The handwriting was careful, not elegant. This was not a man who had been educated beyond necessity, but deliberate. Every letter formed with the slow intention of someone who wanted to be clearly understood. "Miss Whitfield," it read. "My name is Wyatt Callahan. I ranch some miles east of town. I witnessed what occurred yesterday on the main street, and I want to say that I believe those men behaved poorly, though I understand that is not much comfort to you. I am writing because I have a situation that might interest you if you are willing to hear it out. My wife passed 2 years ago. I have 2 children, Lucy, who is 8, and Henry, who is 10. The house has not been run properly since she died, and my children are suffering for it. I am not a wealthy man, but I am an honest one, and what I can offer is this: a room, fair wages by local standards, and a position of respect in my household. I am not asking you to be a mother to my children, unless time and circumstance make that the natural thing. I am asking you to bring some order back to a home that needs it. I will be outside the general store at 9 o'clock this morning, if you are willing to speak with me. If not, I will not trouble you again." Respectfully, Wyatt Callahan. Eleanor read it twice. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and read it a third time more slowly. A job. He was offering her a job. Not marriage, a job. With a room and wages and the word respect used plainly and without decoration, as though it were simply the baseline condition, rather than something remarkable. She noticed that he hadn't apologized for writing to her without introduction. He hadn't spent half the letter explaining himself or hedging. He had described the situation, named his terms, and told her where to find him. She also noticed that he had seen what happened in the street and called it what it was. Those men behaved poorly. Not those men had reasonable concerns. Not you can understand their position. Not perhaps there was fault on both sides. They behaved poorly. Eleanor folded the note along its original creases and set it on top of her suitcase. She had exactly until 9 o'clock to decide whether she was the kind of woman who walked toward uncertain things or the kind who found the next stagecoach out. She already knew which kind she was. She went downstairs, ate the breakfast that was included in the room. Price cornbread and weak coffee, and at 5 minutes before 9, she walked out the front door of Dolan's boarding house and turned right toward the general store. He was already there. She recognized him, she realized as soon as she saw him. He was the man from the boardwalk the evening before. He was taller than she'd expected, lean in the way of men who work hard and eat simply. His face was weathered and not particularly young. He might have been 35, might have been 40. It was difficult to tell with men who spent their lives outdoors. He had dark eyes and the kind of stillness about him that some men cultivate, and others simply have the kind that made you aware of it before you could say why. He tipped his hat when he saw her coming. Actually tipped it. With the small, deliberate courtesy of a man who had been raised to treat women respectfully and had not forgotten how. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Mr. Callahan," she answered. There was a moment of quiet between them that was not uncomfortable. Eleanor was accustomed to silences that pressed in on you with expectation. This one simply sat there waiting for someone to fill it when they were ready. "I got your note," she said. "I figured since you came." "I have questions." "I expected you would," he said. "Go ahead." Eleanor had written the questions in her head during breakfast. She asked them now without preamble. "Why me? There must be women in this town or nearby, who'd be better suited to what you're describing." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. He looked past her briefly down the main street and then back at her face. "Because when every one of those men walked away from you yesterday," he said, "you didn't fall apart. You stood there in the street with your suitcase at your feet and about 50 people watching, and you kept your dignity. That told me something." Eleanor had not expected that answer. She held it for a moment, turned it over the way you turn something over to check if it's real. "What did it tell you?" she asked. "That you don't fall apart when things go wrong," he said. "I need someone who doesn't fall apart. My household has a lot of things going wrong." "What kind of things?" He considered how much to say. She could see him deciding. "My wife was Margaret. She died of fever 2 years back and the children were it was hard. Henry took it hard. Lucy took it quiet, which is sometimes worse. The house has been running on the bare minimum since then. I can manage the cattle. I'm not able to manage everything else and do it justice." "What would my duties be specifically?" "Managing the house, cooking or overseeing cooking. The kitchen garden's been neglected. If you can help the children with their schoolwork, I'd be grateful for that too, though it's not a condition. Lucy needs more reading practice. Henry." He paused. "Henry needs someone who won't try to tell him what to feel." "And wages?" He named a figure. It was modest, but it was honest, in line with what a housekeeper might expect in a town of this size, possibly slightly better. "And the room," she said. "My own room, private." Yes, it was Margaret's sewing room. It's small, but it has a window that faces east. Eleanor thought about east-facing windows, about morning light, about rooms that had been someone else's. "I am not a replacement for your wife," she said. "I want to be clear about that from the beginning. I'm not going to try to be her. I'm not going to try to fill that space, and I'd be grateful if no one expected me to." Something in Wyatt Callahan's face shifted. Not grief exactly, Something older than grief, something that had been sitting there long enough to become simply part of how he looked. "Margaret was Margaret," he said. "I'm not asking for anyone to be her. I'm asking for help, that's all. And if the children refuse to accept me, I'll handle that." "I don't want you to handle it by forcing them," Eleanor said. "Children who are forced to accept someone never actually do. They just learn to perform it." Wyatt looked at her with something she could not quite name. It was somewhere between surprise and recognition. "All right," he said. "How would you handle it?" "Slowly," she said. "By earning it." He nodded once in the unhurried way of a man who has found the answer he was looking for. "When can you be ready to go?" he asked. Eleanor thought about the $4.62. She thought about the stagecoach back to Cheyenne. She thought about the narrow room and the east-facing window, and the two children who were grieving and probably difficult, and possibly a great deal more than difficult. "Give me an hour to collect my things," she said. She turned and walked back toward the boarding house. She did not look back. She didn't need to. She paid Mrs. Dolan for the second night she had not used because it seemed like the right thing to do, and Mrs. Dolan looked at her with that same almost smile from the evening before and said, "You're going out to Callahan's place." It appears so," Eleanor said. "He's a decent man," Mrs. Dolan said. "Quiet. Keeps to himself since Margaret went. Those children have had a rough time of it." She paused. "You'll have your hands full." "I generally do," Eleanor said. She collected her suitcase. She put on her other dress, which was plainer but more practical. She tucked her mother's necklace inside her collar, where it would not catch on anything, and she went back downstairs and out into the morning and found Wyatt Callahan waiting in front of the boarding house with a wagon and 2 horses. He got down and took her suitcase from her and put it in the bed of the wagon without being asked and without making anything of it. She climbed up to the bench seat herself, also without being asked. The town watched them go. She could feel it. The eyes of Dust Creek tracking the rejected mail-order bride as she rode away with the quietest man in town. She did not look at the boardwalk where Samuel Carter had his shop. She did not look at the far end of a town where Thomas Reed had tied his horse. She did not look for Caleb Morris anywhere. She looked forward. She looked at the road east, the one that led away from Dust Creek into the open country. The land that was dry and enormous, and she would not pretend otherwise, terrifying in its sheer scale, after a life lived in the close streets of a city. Wyatt drove without talking, and Eleanor found she didn't mind. They were 3 miles from town before he said anything. "Is there anything you want to know before we get there?" he asked. "What was Henry like before?" she said. "Before his mother died." Wyatt was quiet for long enough that Eleanor thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Funny. He was a funny kid. Used to do these impressions of the horses. Made Margaret laugh every time." He paused. "He hasn't done one since." Eleanor thought about that. "And Lucy?" "She's careful," Wyatt said. "She watches everything. She'll have figured you out before you've figured out your own room." "I'll be careful too then," Eleanor said. Wyatt glanced at her sideways. The look was brief, but something in it told her she'd said the right thing. The road climbed a low ridge and then opened out into a valley, and Eleanor saw the ranch for the first time. She saw immediately that the outline in Wyatt's letter, "The house has not been run properly," was not an exaggeration. The main house was sound enough structurally, but it wore its neglect on the outside clearly. The porch railing was broken on one side. The kitchen garden that ran along the south wall of the house was overgrown with the particular confidence of weeds that have not been challenged in a long time. The barn was in better shape than the house. She would understand later that this was not an accident, and there were cattle in the near pasture that looked well tended. Hy took care of what he knew how to take care of. The wagon stopped in the yard. Eleanor climbed down. She stood in the yard of the Callahan Ranch and looked at the house and the garden and the broken porch railing and the 2 small figures that had appeared in the doorway of the house, standing very close together, watching her with the careful, wounded wariness of children who have already learned that new arrivals can mean new losses. Henry was taller than she expected for 10. He had his father's stillness, but none of his father's patience. Yet she could see the effort it took him to hold still the way his jaw was set. Lucy was small and precise-looking, with dark eyes that moved over Eleanor with the unhurried efficiency of a child who had taught herself to read situations faster than most adults bothered to. Eleanor did not walk toward them immediately. She stood where she was and met their eyes and said clearly enough for both of them to hear without raising her voice. "My name is Miss Whitfield. I'm going to be helping around the house. I'm not here to change anything about your home. I'm just here to help." Henry said nothing. Lucy said, "Our mother liked her garden." Eleanor looked at the overgrown garden. She looked back at Lucy. "I can see she put a lot of care into it," Eleanor said. "I'd like to help bring it back if you'd let me know what she had planted." Lucy looked at her for another moment with those precise dark eyes. "She had tomatoes," Lucy said finally, "and sweet peas. She said sweet peas were the prettiest thing that would grow out here." "Then I'll look for sweet peas," Eleanor said. It was not a victory. It was not even close to a victory. But it was a beginning. Henry turned and went back inside without a word. Lucy watched Eleanor for one more moment and then followed her brother. Wyatt came and stood beside Eleanor and looked at the house. "It'll take time," he said. Not apologetically, just as a fact. "Most things do," Eleanor said. She picked up her suitcase. She walked toward the house. And somewhere between the wagon and the broken porch steps, something settled in Eleanor Whitfield's chest that had not been there since Boston, since before her mother got sick, since before the world had made a habit of reminding her how small and unwanted she was. It was not happiness. It was not safety. It was something quieter and more durable than either of those. It was purpose. The east-facing window in the sewing room looked out over the open valley, and in the morning, the light would come through it before it reached anywhere else on the property. Eleanor stood at that window for a long time after Wyatt showed her the room and left her to settle in. The valley was enormous. The sky above it was the kind of blue that people in cities don't believe in when you describe it. Somewhere out in the pasture, one of the cattle made a low sound that carried all the way to where she stood. She was a long way from Boston. She opened her suitcase and put her mother's Bible on the small shelf above the window. She hung her second dress on the hook behind the door. She placed the photograph of her parents on the windowsill where the morning light would fall on it. Then she rolled up her sleeves, went back downstairs, and started assessing the kitchen. There was a great deal of work to be done. She was ready to begin, downstairs. She could hear Henry somewhere in the back of the house, moving around with the deliberate heaviness of a boy, making a statement out of every footstep. She could hear Lucy on the porch, very quiet, in the way Lucy was apparently quiet, watchful, and present, and absorbing everything. She could hear very faintly from the direction of the barn the particular sound of a man doing hard physical work, with the focused, methodical energy of someone who has learned to keep himself occupied. Eleanor opened the kitchen cupboards one by one and took note of what was there and what was missing and what needed to be replaced. She was not here to be chosen. She was not here to win anyone's approval. She was here because she had chosen this, and because there was something in this broken, imperfect grieving place that she recognized. It needed work. So did she. And for the first time in a very long time, Eleanor Whitfield thought that might be enough. Eleanor had been at the Callahan Ranch for 4 days before Henry spoke directly to her for the first time, not pleasantly. Not with the cautious warmth his sister had begun to show in small, careful increments. Henry spoke to Eleanor the way a boy speaks when he has decided that silence is no longer sufficient and that something stronger is required. She was in the kitchen working through the second systematic cleaning of the cupboards. The first pass had been about assessment. This one was about actual scrubbing. When she heard him come in from outside and stop in the doorway, "You moved the blue tin," he said. Eleanor did not stop what she was doing. "I did. It was in the way of the flour. My mother kept it there." "I know. Mrs. Callahan had a system that made sense to her. I'm trying to understand it before I change anything." "You already changed it." Eleanor set down the cloth she'd been using and turned around. Henry stood in the kitchen doorway with mud on his boots and the specific expression of a boy who wants a fight badly enough that he will manufacture one if nothing presents itself naturally. He was 10 years old, and he was hurting, and he was not. Eleanor decided going to be managed. "You're right," she said. I moved it without asking you first. I should have. Where would you like it? Henry blinked. He had not expected that. She could see the way it disrupted whatever he'd prepared to say next, the way a stone disrupts a current. Where it was, he said finally. Eleanor picked up the blue tin. It was dented old, had once held loose tea, and now held an assortment of small things that clearly meant something to someone. Buttons and a piece of ribbon, and a small horse carved from a stick of wood. And she set it back in its original place on the shelf above the stove. There, she said. I won't move it again without asking. Henry looked at the tin. He looked at Eleanor. He turned and walked back outside without another word. Lucy appeared in the doorway. Approximately 30 seconds later, with the uncanny timing Eleanor was beginning to understand was simply how Lucy operated. She had a way of being present at the precise moment that mattered without ever making it seem intentional. He doesn't hate you, Lucy said. I know, Eleanor said. He just... Lucy searched for the word with the seriousness of a child who takes language very seriously. He hates that he doesn't hate you. That's worse. Eleanor looked at the 8-year-old standing in the kitchen doorway, in her worn dress and her careful eyes, and thought that Margaret Callahan had raised a child who understood people better than most adults managed. What about you? Eleanor asked. Do you hate that you don't hate me? Lucy considered this with genuine thoughtfulness. I'm still deciding, she said. That seems fair, Eleanor said. Lucy came all the way into the kitchen then and sat on the stool by the work table, and Eleanor went back to cleaning, and neither of them spoke for a while, and it was the most companionable silence Eleanor had experienced since arriving in Wyoming. The days at the ranch had a rhythm that Eleanor was learning the way you learn a piece of music first, the shape of it, then the individual notes, then slowly the feeling underneath. Wyatt rose before dawn. She could hear him moving through the house in the dark, the particular pattern of his footsteps that she had already memorized, without meaning to, heavy on the first step of the stairs light, coming off the last one. He made coffee badly, and drank it without complaint, and was out in the barn by the time the sky was lightening. Eleanor rose an hour after him. She made proper coffee. She had strong opinions about coffee formed over years of drinking bad versions of it, and understanding precisely what the difference was, and she had breakfast started before the children came down. These were not dramatic gestures. She was not trying to announce herself. She simply believed that a house ran better when certain things happened consistently, and she was the person who was there to make certain things happen consistently. Henry came down to breakfast and ate without speaking to her, but also without incident, which she was counting as progress. Lucy came down and sat across from her brother and talked. Lucy talked in the mornings, a continuous, pleasantly meandering commentary on whatever was in her mind and the rhythm of it. The ordinary domestic sound of a child talking over breakfast seemed to do something to the quality of the air in the kitchen, made it less heavy. Wyatt came in from the barn after the children had eaten, and he sat at the head of the table and ate what Eleanor had made with the concentrated appreciation of a man who has been surviving on his own cooking for 2 years and knows the difference. He said, "This is good," about the eggs the first morning. Eleanor said, "Thank you," and meant it simply, and Wyatt nodded and went back to eating, and that was more or less the shape of their interactions for the first several days. Functional. Respectful. Careful in the way that two people are careful around each other when they are both intelligent enough to know that things are fragile, and neither of them wants to be the one to break something. On the 5th day, the first real thing happened. Eleanor had spent the morning working in the kitchen garden. The weeds had been more than she'd anticipated. She had underestimated them, which she admitted to herself without pleasure, because she did not like underestimating things, and the ground was harder than it looked, and she had blisters forming on both hands by mid-morning. She had found under the weeds along the south wall the remnants of the kitchen garden Margaret Callahan had planted. Tomato frames collapsed but recoverable. The dried skeletons of what might have been sweet peas climbing a trellis. She was on her knees in the dirt pulling weeds when she heard footsteps behind her. She expected Lucy. It was Henry. He stood a few feet away from her and looked at what she was doing. "Those are the sweet pea steaks," he said. "I know. Your sister told me." He was quiet. Then, "Mama planted those the spring before she got sick. She said if she kept them going long enough they'd spread on their own. Eleanor sat back on her heels and looked up at him. Do you know if she had seeds saved anywhere? Sometimes gardeners save seeds from the strongest plants. Henry looked at her with the guarded expression that was his default. Then slowly, there's a tin in the shed, small one. She labeled things. Would you be willing to look for it? He was quiet for a long moment. Eleanor did not push. She had learned already that pushing Henry produced exactly the opposite of what you wanted. Maybe, he said. He walked away. 2 hours later he came back and set a small tin on the ground beside her knee and walked away again without a word. Eleanor opened it. Inside, in a careful hand that she recognized from labels on the kitchen jars, Margaret's handwriting, neat and practical, and somehow still present in this small tin, were packets of seeds, each one labeled. Sweet peas, tomatoes, marigolds, carrots, lavender. Eleanor held the tin in both hands and breathed. She understood what Henry had done. He had not forgiven her. He had not accepted her. But he had given her something that mattered to him, and that was not nothing. That was in its own language an enormous thing. She planted the sweet pea seeds that afternoon. That evening at supper, Henry did not speak to her. But when she passed the bread, he took it from her hand directly, instead of waiting for her to set it on the table first. It was a small thing. Eleanor noticed it the way you notice the first sound of water running after a long freeze. She did not comment on it. She simply passed the butter next, and the meal continued. It was the end of the first week when Eleanor encountered the other complication. She had understood in the abstract that a woman in her position in a small frontier town would be subject to a certain amount of scrutiny and commentary. She had not fully appreciated how direct that commentary would be. She had gone into Dust Creek with Wyatt on the Saturday supply run. She had a list she'd compiled over the week of things. The kitchen and the house needed written out in her clear, organized hand, and she had climbed down from the wagon in front of the general store, and she had barely gotten through the door before she understood that her arrival in town was going to be an event. The women gathered near the fabric bolts went quiet in a way that was not actually quiet at all. It was the specific pressurized silence of women who are actively not saying something they are very much thinking. Eleanor went about her business. She had a list, and she was going to address it. She was comparing the price of 2 grades of flour when she became aware that someone had positioned themselves beside her with the particular deliberateness of a person who wants to be spoken to. She turned. The woman beside her was perhaps 40, well-dressed by local standards, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the authority in a room. "You're the woman Wyatt Callahan brought out to his place," the woman said. Not a question. "I'm the woman who took a position at the Callahan Ranch, yes," Eleanor said. "Eleanor Whitfield." "Mabel Hargrove." No offer of a handshake. "My husband owns the bank." "How do you do?" Eleanor said pleasantly. Mabel Hargrove looked at her with the evaluating eye of a woman who has assigned Eleanor to a category and is confirming that the assignment was correct. "People are talking," she said. "People generally do," Eleanor said. "A single woman living on a widower's property." Mabel let the implications sit in the air between them. Eleanor set the flour sack in her basket and met Mabel Hargrove's eyes with the absolute directness of a woman who has spent a week on her knees in a garden, pulling weeds, and is not about to apologize for anything. "I am employed as a housekeeper," she said clearly. "Mr. Callahan's children needed care, and his household needed managing. He offered a fair wage, and I accepted. That is the complete accounting of the situation." "Of course," Mabel said in the tone of a woman who means the opposite. "Was there something I could help you with, Mrs. Hargrove?" Eleanor said. Mabel looked at her for another moment, recalibrated visibly, and then turned and moved away with the smooth, unhurried dignity of a woman who has won by simply continuing to exist. Eleanor paid for her flour and the rest of her list and went back out to the wagon. Wyatt was loading supplies into the wagon bed. He didn't look up. "Mabel Hargrove talked to you." "She did." "She talked to you like you were either a charity case or a scandal." "She managed to suggest both simultaneously," Eleanor said. "She's efficient." Wyatt made a sound that was almost a laugh. It was the closest she'd heard him come to one. She does that to everyone. Don't let it. I'm not letting it anything, Eleanor said. It's fine. He did look up then. Looked at her in the direct assessing way. He had not rude, not intrusive. Just the look of a man who pays attention to what's actually there rather than what he expects to see. All right, he said. She climbed back up to the bench seat. He finished loading and climbed up beside her, and they drove out of Dust Creek in the direction of the ranch, and Eleanor spent the ride back, deciding that Mabel Hargrove and every other person in that town who had opinions about her living situation could spend their energy however they chose, and it would make exactly no difference to how she spent hers. She had a kitchen garden to bring back from the dead, and 2 grieving children to handle carefully, and a household that needed her attention. She did not have time for other people's narratives about her. It was in the second week that Eleanor began to understand something about Wyatt Callahan that she had not initially seen. She had pegged him in the first days as a quiet man who communicated primarily through action rather than words, a not uncommon type in her experience, and not an unpleasant one. He did what he said he would do. He kept his word. He treated her with a consistent, undemonstrative respect that was more comfortable than any effusive attention would have been. But in the second week, she started to notice things. He noticed things. He paid attention in a way that was not obvious until you were looking for it. He noticed when the porch railing was repaired, Eleanor had done it herself with lumber from the shed and a borrowed hammer because it needed doing and waiting for him to get to it. Seemed inefficient, and he stopped and looked at it for a long moment on his way past without saying anything. But at supper that evening he said quietly, "That was good work on the railing." He noticed when Lucy came downstairs with her hair properly braided for the first time in what appeared to have been quite a while. He noticed when Henry ate 2 full helpings of supper without being prompted, and the quality of the silence at the table was different, less armored, more simply quiet. He noticed these things without making them into events, without announcing them. And Eleanor found herself thinking that this was either the most naturally perceptive man she had ever encountered, or a man who had trained himself very carefully to pay attention to the things that mattered. Either way, she respected it. On Wednesday of the second week, she was in the sitting room in the evening with Lucy, helping the girl work through a reading primer that was slightly too easy for her. She was going to need something more challenging, and Eleanor was already composing in her head the letter she would write to the lending library in Cheyenne when Henry came in from outside and stopped in the middle of the room and held out his hand. In his palm was a small carved horse. Not the rough, simple kind that a 10-year-old boy might produce by whittling at a stick. This was careful work. The proportions were accurate. The legs had a quality of movement in them, a sense of the animal paused mid-stride. Eleanor went very still. "Did you make that?" she asked. Henry's jaw tightened. "Pa says I waste time on it." She looked at the horse. She looked at Henry. She said with complete sincerity, "Your father is wrong." The words appeared to land on Henry like something he had not anticipated and was not prepared to absorb. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something underneath the guardedness, something uncertain and very young. "It's just whittling," he said. "It is not just whittling," Eleanor said. "May I?" She held out her hand. He put the horse in her palm after a moment's hesitation. She turned it over, carefully studying it. "How long have you been doing this?" "Since I was little." "How many have you made?" A pause. "A lot." "Where are they?" "Shed, in a box." Eleanor handed the horse back to him with the respect she would give any object of genuine craft. "Tomorrow," she said, "would you show me?" Henry took the horse back. He stood there for a moment with something clearly happening behind his expression that he didn't have the vocabulary for yet, and then he turned and went upstairs to bed without answering. But the next afternoon, he came to her in the kitchen and said, "I can show you now if you want," in the same tone he might use to offer something completely indifferent to him, which was the tone that meant the exact opposite. "Yes," Eleanor said, and put down what she was doing immediately. She followed him to the shed. There was a wooden box on the shelf along the far wall. Henry pulled it down and set it on the work table and stood back. Eleanor looked inside. There were at least 30 of them. Horses mostly. A few dogs. A bird she thought might be an eagle. One that was unmistakably a person, small female, with carefully rendered details, a dress hair. Eleanor did not ask who that one was. "Henry," she said. "They're just things I do," he said quickly, with the preemptive defense of a child who has been told too many times that the things he loves are not worth loving. "They are exceptional," Eleanor said. "That is not a polite thing I am saying to make you feel good. I mean it specifically. The proportions are accurate. You understand how bodies move. That is a skill that most adults with years of practice do not have." She picked up the eagle, set it down, picked up one of the horses, a running one, the most ambitious, technically the hardest to get right. "Where did you learn?" "Nowhere," he said. I look at them, and then I try to make what I see." "You have a gift," Eleanor said simply. Henry did not have a response for that. He stood in the shed with his hands in his pockets and the box of carved animals between them, and something moved through his expression. Not resolution, not peace, but the beginning of something that might eventually become both. He didn't say anything, but he didn't dismiss it either. They walked back to the house in the late afternoon light. And that evening at supper, for the first time since Eleanor had arrived, Henry asked her a direct question. "Do you think they're worth keeping, the carvings?" "I think that they're worth showing to people," Eleanor said. Henry thought about that. Wyatt at the head of the table had gone very still. "What people?" Henry said. "I'm not sure yet," Eleanor said, "but I'd like to think about it." Henry nodded once and went back to his supper. Wyatt did not look at Eleanor directly, but she saw him set down his fork with the particular deliberateness of a man who needs a moment to collect himself, and she understood without either of them saying anything that this conversation had mattered in ways she had not fully planned. It was at the end of the second week that Eleanor heard from the men who had rejected her. She was at the general store again. She had come in alone this time on an errand that didn't require Wyatt driving the smaller wagon with the older horse who was steady and reliable, and whose name she had learned was Barnabas when Samuel Carter appeared at her elbow. "Miss Whitfield," he said. She turned. He looked as prosperous as he had on the day of her arrival, and slightly less certain of himself, which was an improvement. "Mr. Carter," she said. "I've been hoping to speak with you," he said. "Have you?" She continued looking at the bolts of fabric in front of her. Lucy needed a new dress. She had one that was too short, and another that was wearing through at the elbows, and Eleanor was trying to determine which of the available calicos was the best quality at the most reasonable price. "I believe He paused, tried again. "I was hasty when you arrived. I said things that were unkind. You said I was not young enough and not delicate enough," Eleanor said calmly. "And then you walked away. That's accurate." Carter's neck reddened. "I was wrong," he said. "I've heard people say you've done remarkable things out at the Callahan place, that the children are doing better, that the house... Is that what this is about?" Eleanor turned and looked at him directly. "You heard good reports and decided to revisit your investment assessment." Carter blinked. "I beg your pardon. You evaluated me like a purchase on that street," Eleanor said without heat, simply as a factual observation. "And now you're reconsidering the price. I understand the logic, but I'm not for sale, Mr. Carter. I wasn't then, and I'm not now. Good day." She turned back to the fabric, and after a moment, she heard him leave. Thomas Reed tried 2 days later, catching her on the street outside the post office. It was more genuinely awkward than Carter had been. He had the discomfort of a man who knows he behaved badly and has not yet worked out a comfortable way to present himself on the other side of that knowledge. "Miss Whitfield," he said, and took off his hat, which was at least a gesture. "Mr. Reed," she said, "I owe you an apology." "You don't owe me anything," she said. "You made your decision. That's done." "I made the wrong one." She looked at him. He was sincere, she thought. Genuinely uncomfortable with his own behavior, which spoke moderately well of him. But sincerity about past mistakes did not constitute a claim on her future. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she said with complete honesty. "Good afternoon." Caleb Morris caught her on the street the following week and apologized for calling her too educated, which she found both easier and harder to receive than the other apologies. Easier because he was clearly more embarrassed by it than the other two harder, because she could hear in it the particular echo of all the times in her life that her intelligence had been held against her. It was a stupid thing to say, he told her. My mother would have taken a switch to me for it if she'd heard. Your mother sounds sensible, Eleanor said. I accept your apology, Mr. Morris. Is there any chance? No, she said gently. But thank you for asking properly. She walked away, feeling something that was not quite triumph and not quite peace, but existed somewhere between the two. The men who had rejected her in the street on the day of her arrival were now seeking her out to apologize, and she found that she felt nothing particularly vengeful about it. What she felt was something quieter and more final. She had moved past the moment on that street. She was somewhere else now, and where she was now was better. What she could not have anticipated was how the town's attitude would shift in ways that were not always kind, even when they were meant to be. People began to look at her with a certain approval that carried in it the unmistakable flavor of surprise, as if her competence and capability were remarkable precisely because they had expected so little from the woman who had been rejected by 3 men in a row on a Tuesday morning. She found this harder to bear than the original whispers. Mabel Hargrove stopped her on the street one afternoon to tell her with expansive generosity that she was apparently doing quite well out at the Callahan Ranch, and that people had revised their initial impressions considerably, and that she, Mabel, for one, had always believed a woman could make her own way if she was determined enough. Is that what you believed? Eleanor said. Why, yes, Mabel said. How fortunate, Eleanor said pleasantly, and excused herself and walked away. She told none of this to Wyatt. It wasn't his to manage. She did not need him to ride into town and defend her honor or confront anyone on her behalf. That was not the arrangement, and it was not who she was. But on the evening after the encounter with Mabel, she was sitting on the back step of the house in the cooling dark. She had developed the habit of sitting there after the children were in bed, taking 20 minutes of quiet before she went to her own room, when she heard the back door open, and Wyatt came and sat down on the step beside her. They sat in silence for a while. The town giving you trouble, he said eventually. The town is giving me exactly what I expected, she said. I'm fine. You don't always have to be fine. She looked at him. It was dark enough that she could not see his expression clearly, but she could hear something in the way he had said it, not patronizing, not pushing, just offering the room. I'm fine, she said again, but this time it was something different. Not a wall. More like an acknowledgement that she had heard what he offered and was choosing for now to hold it. He nodded. They sat for another few minutes. He said, Henry showed me the horses this morning. The carvings. He told me, Eleanor said. She hadn't been sure. She had not known whether Henry would share that or keep it between them. I didn't know he'd made so many, Wyatt said quietly. There was something in his voice she had not heard before. The particular quality of a man who has realized he missed something important and is reckoning with that. He's been making them since he was small, Eleanor said. He told me. Yeah. A pause. I guess I thought it was just something he did to keep busy. I didn't look. Eleanor was careful with her next words. You were managing a lot. He needed me to look, Wyatt said, simply, without excuse. She understood then something about Wyatt Callahan, that the previous weeks had been quietly assembling from pieces that this was a man who held himself to a very high standard, higher perhaps than was entirely fair, and that his silences were not indifference, but the particular concentrated seriousness of a person who is always thinking about what he should have done better. He knows you're proud of him, Eleanor said. How do you know that? Because when he showed me the box, she said, the first thing he asked was whether his father had seen them. Wyatt was quiet for a long time. Then he got up and went inside, and Eleanor sat alone on the step for a few more minutes, and from upstairs she heard the low sound of a man's voice and a boy's response. And the conversation went on for a while, and eventually she heard something that might have been both of them laughing, not loudly, just the quiet sound of two people finding their way back to something that had been between them all along. She stayed on the step a little longer than usual that night, and when she finally went inside and climbed the stairs to the east-facing room and looked out the window at the enormous dark sky, with its impossible number of stars. She thought that whatever she had come to Wyoming looking for, this was not quite it, and also that it was considerably better than what she'd imagined. She had not come here to be saved. She had come here to be useful. But somewhere in the middle of that, something was happening that she had not planned for. She was becoming necessary. Not in the desperate, dependent way that made a person afraid to leave, but in the way that a thing becomes necessary when it is right for where it is. The way water is necessary to a particular piece of land. The way light is necessary to a particular room. She thought about that for a while, and she thought about Wyatt Callahan sitting beside her on the step in the dark, saying, "You don't always have to be fine," and the particular quality of that silence between them. She had been in Wyoming for 3 weeks. She had planted sweet peas from dead seeds in a dead garden. She had taught Henry that his gift was a gift. She had sat with Lucy over a reading primer and understood that the girl was brilliant and bored and needed harder books immediately. She had learned that Wyatt drank his coffee wrong and did not complain about it, and that he noticed everything, and that his worst quality and his best quality were the same thing. He held himself responsible for all of it. She had $4.62 when she arrived. She now had the beginnings of wages, and a room with an east-facing window, and a family that was in its broken and tentative and slowly mending way beginning to let her in. None of this was what she had planned when she answered those advertisements in Boston. It was something far less certain and far more real. And on the morning of her 22nd day at the Callahan Ranch, she woke before dawn and lay in the dark of the east-facing room and listened to the sounds of the house breathing around her. Wyatt's boots on the stairs, the creak of the front door, a horse stirring in the barn, and she realized that she had stopped counting the days. She had simply started living in them. That morning at breakfast, Henry sat across from her and said without looking up from his plate, "I was thinking, the horses, if somebody would pay for them." "They would," Eleanor said immediately. He looked up. "How do you know?" "Because good work is worth paying for," she said. "And yours is good work." He looked back down at his plate. But the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile yet, and was clearly in the process of becoming one. Lucy said, "I think so too." Henry said, "Nobody asked you." Lucy said serenely, "I said it anyway." And Wyatt at the head of the table reached for his coffee and said nothing at all, and the expression on his face was the closest thing to happiness Eleanor had seen on it in 3 weeks. She picked up her fork and ate her breakfast, and thought that the morning light through the kitchen window was particularly good today. She thought other things too, but she kept those to herself, for now. The sweet peas came up on a Thursday. Eleanor was not expecting them. She had planted them without certainty seeds from a tin that had sat in a shed through 2 Wyoming winter's seeds that had every right to be dead, and she had watered them and tended the soil, and told herself that if they didn't grow, it was no reflection on the trying. And then, on an ordinary Thursday morning in her 5th week at the ranch, Lucy came running into the kitchen with mud on her boots and her careful eyes wide open. For the first time Eleanor had seen, and she said breathless, "They're coming up, Miss Whitfield. Mama's sweet peas are coming up." Eleanor went out with her, and they stood side by side in the garden and looked at the thin green shoots pushing through the dark soil, and Lucy slipped her hand into Eleanor's without saying anything, and Eleanor held it carefully, the way you hold something you've been trusted with, and neither of them spoke for a while. Henry appeared from the direction of the barn and stood a few feet away and looked at the shoots. "Huh," he said. That was all. But he stood there for a long time before he went back to his chores, and Eleanor understood that "huh" from Henry Callahan was its own language, and in that language it meant something close to thank you. She told Wyatt about it that evening. They had developed a habit. She was not sure when exactly it had solidified into a habit, but it had, of talking briefly in the evening after the children were in bed. Not long conversations. Not the kind of conversations that required anything. Just the natural exchange of 2 people at the end of a day sharing what had happened and what it had meant. He listened to her describe Lucy's face when she saw the shoots, and something moved through his expression. Not grief this time, or not only grief, but grief mixed with something warmer and more present. Margaret planted those the year we had a bad spring, he said. She said if you could get something beautiful to grow in a hard year, it meant the hard year didn't win. Eleanor was quiet. She was right about most things, Wyatt said. Then after a moment, she would have liked you. Eleanor did not know what to do with that. She held it carefully the way she'd held Lucy's hand. That's a generous thing to say, she said finally. It's a true thing, he said. I went to bed shortly after, and Eleanor sat for a while in the kitchen, with her hands around a cooling cup of coffee, and thought about Margaret Callahan planting sweet peas in a hard year, and about the thin green shoots pushing up through soil that had been neglected and packed hard by 2 Wyoming winters, and about what it meant for something to survive anyway. She thought she was beginning to understand Wyoming. The trouble started in the 6th week, and it did not start quietly. Eleanor was in town. She had begun to feel comfortable, making the supply run alone, had established a working relationship with the owner of the general store, based on reliable payment and specific ordering. When she overheard something that stopped her between one step and the next. 2 women talking near the back of the store with the lowered but not low enough voices of people who want to be heard without being seen to want it. Hargrove says the bank is calling in the note on the Callahan property. No. His wife told me directly. He's 2 payments behind. Has been since the spring. Wyatt Callahan borrowed against the property when Margaret was sick the doctor bills. And now, does he know? He'll get a letter. Or maybe he's already gotten it. But Hargrove says if the full sum isn't settled by the end of autumn. Eleanor turned and walked out of the store without buying anything. She stood in the street for a moment. Hargrove. The banker. Mabel Hargrove's husband. The man whose wife had suggested in the tones of someone doing Eleanor a gracious favor that she was apparently doing quite well out at the Callahan place. The man who was apparently also preparing to take that place away. She got back in the wagon and drove back to the ranch with the particular controlled calm of a person whose mind is moving very fast under a very still surface. She thought about what she knew. She thought about what she didn't know. She thought about whether it was her place to say anything. She thought about Lucy's hand in hers, about Henry's box of carved horses, about Wyatt saying she would have liked you with the simple honesty of a man who does not say things he doesn't mean. It was her place. She found Wyatt in the barn. He looked up when she came in, registered the expression on her face, and set down the harness he'd been repairing. What happened? He said. I need to ask you something directly, she said, and I need you to answer me directly. What is the situation with the banknote on this property? The silence that followed told her everything before he said a word. Who told you? He said. Not a question. His voice was flat in a way she hadn't heard before. It doesn't matter who told me. Is it true? Wyatt put both hands on the stall door and looked down at them. The posture of a man who has been carrying something heavy for so long, he's forgotten he's carrying it and only notices now that someone else can see the weight. 2 payments behind, he said. I've been trying to make it up. The summer stock sales were down. We had a fence issue that cost... He stopped. Started again. I've been managing it. Wyatt. She waited until he looked at her. When is the deadline? End of October. That was 11 weeks. How much? He told her the figure. It was not impossible. It was also not manageable, not with the ranch's current revenue, not in 11 weeks. Why didn't you say anything? She said. Because it's my problem. You brought me here to help with your household, not with my finances. Those 2 things are connected, Eleanor said. Whether you intended them to be or not. If this ranch goes to the bank, your household... She stopped herself from finishing that sentence, because finishing it meant saying out loud that Lucy and Henry would lose this place, and she was not going to say that in this barn, in this moment. Wyatt's jaw was tight. I know what it means. Then let me help. You're helping already. You're doing... He shook his head. This isn't what I hired you for. I know bookkeeping, Eleanor said. I managed accounts for the seamstress shop in Boston for 4 years. I understand ledgers and notes and the mechanics of what banks can and can't legally do. Let me look at whatever Hargrove sent you. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment, and there was considerable pride in him, the kind that was not vanity, but something deeper. The self-respect of a man who built things with his hands and carried his obligations without complaint was at war with the reality of 11 weeks and a figure that didn't add up. The reality won. Barely. He went to the house and came back with a letter. He handed it to her without a word. She read it in the barn, standing in the light from the open door. She read it twice. Then she read one paragraph a third time. "Wyatt," she said carefully, "this interest calculation is wrong." He looked up. "The rate they've applied here." She pointed to the specific line. "This is higher than the rate in the original note. They've added a penalty clause that, if I'm reading this correctly, was not in the original terms." "I don't—" He stopped. "What does that mean?" "It means Hargrove may be charging you more than he's legally entitled to charge," Eleanor said. "It means the figure he's told you you owe may not be the correct figure." She looked up from the letter. "Do you have the original note, the document you signed?" He stared at her. "It'll be in the house, in the tin box in the bedroom closet." "Get it." "I got it." She sat at the kitchen table and laid both documents side by side and went through them line by line with the focused, unhurried precision of a woman who has been doing this kind of work since she was 19 years old and understands exactly where the numbers tell the truth and where they don't. Lucy came downstairs and found her at the table surrounded by papers. "What are you doing?" Lucy asked. "Arithmetic," Eleanor said. Lucy looked at the papers. "Is that about the ranch?" Eleanor looked up. Lucy's expression was the one she wore when she already knew something and was waiting to see if the adults in the room were going to tell her the truth or a comfortable version of it. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Are we going to lose it?" "Not if I can help it," Eleanor said. Lucy sat down at the table across from her. "Can I help?" Eleanor looked at the 8-year-old across the mess of papers and made a decision. "Can you add columns of numbers? Fast," Lucy said. "Then yes, start here." They were still at the table when Henry came in for supper and stopped dead in the doorway at the sight of his sister doing mathematics with a focused intensity she usually reserved for the things she loved. "What's happening?" he said. "We're fixing something," Lucy said without looking up. Henry stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he came in and sat down and said, "What do you need me to do?" Wyatt came in from the barn an hour later and stopped in the entrance to the kitchen and looked at the three of them at the table. Eleanor, Lucy, Henry papers spread between them. Lucy calling out numbers, and Eleanor writing, and Henry holding a straight edge along the column, so neither of them lost their place, and something happened to his face that Eleanor did not see because her eyes were on the numbers. But Lucy saw it, and later in the way that Lucy always found the moment she told Eleanor, "Papa looked like he forgot he was sad." Eleanor found the discrepancy. It was not a small one. The penalty clause Hargrove had inserted into his demand letter added nearly 30% to the sum Wyatt believed he owed. When she compared the original note language to the demand letter language, the difference was unambiguous. Either Hargrove had made a significant error in his calculations, or he had made a deliberate choice in them. She thought about the way Mabel Hargrove had looked at her in the general store on her first Saturday in town. She thought about the women talking near the fabric bolts. She thought about the word people used in small towns for a property that a bank was about to acquire below its value opportunity. She thought Hargrove had made a deliberate choice. She told Wyatt what she had found. She laid it out plainly with the documentation organized to support each point, the way she had learned to organize things in Boston when she needed to make an argument that would be listened to. Wyatt sat across the table and read what she showed him. He read it slowly, the way a man reads something when the stakes are high enough that he needs to be certain he understands every word. When he finished, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "He knew I wouldn't check," he said. "A lot of people don't," Eleanor said. "It's why it works. He figured I was distracted, with Margaret with the children. He figured correctly about the timing," Eleanor said. "He figured wrong about what would happen next." Wyatt looked at her. "What happens next?" "You write to the Territorial Land Office," Eleanor said. "And you write to a lawyer if you can get one. I'll write the letter if you need me to. I can document the discrepancy clearly enough that any competent legal eye will see it immediately. A lawyer costs money, I know, But if Hargrove is doing this to you, he is almost certainly doing it to others. And a lawyer who sees an opportunity to recover penalties against a fraudulent banker is a lawyer who may be motivated to work on the promise of compensation rather than payment up front. She paused. Do you know if anyone else in the area has had dealings with Hargrove's bank? Wyatt thought about it. Turner, up the North Valley. He said something about his payments last spring. I didn't pay it much attention. Talk to Turner, Eleanor said. Wyatt looked at her. He looked at the papers on the table. He looked at Lucy, who had fallen asleep in her chair, with her cheek on her hand, and her column of numbers finished and neat at her elbow. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, Eleanor. It was the first time he had used her first name. She noticed it the way you notice a door opening in a wall you hadn't known was a wall. You don't have to thank me, she said. I wasn't going to, he said. I was going to say I was wrong about what this was, what I thought I was offering you when I wrote that letter. You offered me a fair wage and a room. I thought I was doing you a favor, he said quietly. The woman nobody wanted and the widower who needed help. I thought I was... He shook his head. I've been sitting across from you at that table for 6 weeks, watching you run this household and raise my children better than I've managed in 2 years, and now this, and I... He stopped, started again. I don't know what I'm trying to say. You're trying to say you've revised your assessment, Eleanor said. Yeah, he said. I guess I am. She looked at him across the table covered in papers, across Lucy asleep in her chair, across the kitchen that smelled of the supper she'd made, and the coffee that was still warm. So have I, she said. That was all. It was enough. Eleanor wrote the letter to the Territorial Land Office that night after Wyatt had carried Lucy upstairs and Henry had gone to bed and the house was quiet. She wrote it carefully with all the precision she possessed, citing the specific discrepancy and the specific language of both documents and what the territorial law said about fraudulent modification of lending terms. She was still writing when she heard the first crack of thunder. She looked up. The second crack was louder. Then rain sudden and heavy hitting the roof with the concentrated force of a summer storm that meant business. She finished the letter. She blotted it dry and folded it and set it on top of her documents pile. She heard it then. Lucy. The sound was wrong immediately. Not the normal sound of a child disturbed by the thunder. Something thinner and too fast. Eleanor was out of her chair before she had consciously decided to move across the kitchen and up the stairs with the particular speed of someone whose body has already understood what her mind is still catching up to. She pushed open Lucy's door. The child was burning. Eleanor put her hand on Lucy's forehead and felt the fever under her palm like a coal, and the rational part of her mind that she relied on in emergencies said high, too high. How long? And simultaneously, she heard herself calling out for Wyatt with the kind of steadiness she had trained herself to maintain because she had been in this room before. Not this room exactly, but this situation. Her mother, the fever that came in the night and needed everything you had and gave you nothing back. Wyatt was in the doorway in seconds. He took one look at Lucy and went pale. How bad? He said. Bad enough, Eleanor said. I need water, cold as you can get it from the well. I need every clean cloth in the house, and I need you to tell me where the nearest doctor is and how long it takes to get there. 14 miles, Wyatt said. In this the road floods. Then we're not waiting for a doctor, Eleanor said. Go, water and cloths, now. I went. Henry appeared in the doorway in his nightshirt, and Eleanor turned and looked at him and said clearly and without panic, Your sister is very ill. I need you to go downstairs and start the fire in the kitchen stove and put the largest pot of water on to heat. Can you do that? Henry's face was white. He looked past her at Lucy. Henry. She said his name with the full weight of what she needed him to be in this moment. I need you. Right now. He pulled himself together in a way that was extraordinary for a 10-year-old, and entirely unsurprising to Eleanor, who had understood for weeks that under the anger and the grief there was a child of considerable character. Yes, ma'am, he said. He went downstairs. Eleanor heard him moving, heard the stove, and turned back to Lucy. The child was awake and frightened. Her eyes tracked Eleanor with the unfocused, urgent need of someone whose body was confusing her and who was looking to the nearest stable thing for anchor. "I'm here," Eleanor said. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." "It hurts," Lucy said. Her voice was thin. "I know. We're going to help that." Eleanor kept her voice even, kept her hands steady, tucked the blanket back from Lucy's body, because the worst thing with a fever was trapping the heat. Wyatt came back with the water and the cloths. He stopped in the doorway, and Eleanor could see him wanting to take over, wanting to do something. The particular anguish of a father who cannot fix the thing that is wrong with his child. "Talk to her," Eleanor said. "Hold her hand. That's the most important thing right now. Keep her calm." "What are you going to do?" "Bring the fever down," Eleanor said. "I've done this before." He looked at her. She met his eyes across the sick room, and what passed between them in that moment was not tender. It was something sterner and more necessary than tenderness. The mutual recognition of two people who trust each other completely and are about to need that trust. He sat beside Lucy. He took her hand. He began talking to her in the low, steady voice that Eleanor had heard him use with the horses when they were frightened. That voice that said, "I am here. Nothing will hurt you while I'm here." And Eleanor worked. She worked through the night. She had learned what she knew from her mother's illness, not from books, though she had read what she could find, but from the brutal education of sitting beside someone you love, while their body fights something you cannot see, and learning what helps and what doesn't, and what the difference looks like. Cold cloths changed every few minutes. Small sips of water. Watching the breathing pattern with the focused attention of someone who knows what changes in that pattern mean, and what to do when they change. The storm hammered the house all night. The kind of storm that made the walls feel thin and the world feel enormous and dangerous. Wyatt did not leave the room. He sat beside Lucy and held her hand and talked to her, and occasionally Eleanor said something directive. Change the cloth, turn her slightly. Give her a sip now, and he did it without question, without delay. And this partnership in the worst hours of the night was the most intimate thing Eleanor had experienced with another person in years. At 2 a.m, Lucy's fever spiked. Eleanor saw it in the rigidity of the child's body, in the way her eyes went distant, and she said to Wyatt, "Hold her, gently but firmly. Hold her." And she worked with everything she had and everything she knew, and the room was very quiet, except for the rain, and Wyatt's voice saying Lucy's name over and over in the dark. Henry appeared in the doorway at one point. Eleanor didn't know what time it was. She looked at him, this 10-year-old boy standing in the hallway in the middle of the night with fear on his face and his hands at his sides and no way to make any of it stop, and she said, "She's fighting Henry. She's fighting hard." Is she going to be okay? Eleanor had made a decision long ago, in the months of her mother's illness, that she would not give children comfortable lies when they were old enough to understand uncomfortable truths. Henry Callahan was more than old enough. "I am doing everything I know," she said, "and I am not stopping." Henry looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of someone who has decided to trust something, and went back to the top of the stairs and sat there. And he was still sitting there at 3 o'clock awake, keeping his own kind of vigil. Eleanor broke the fever at 4 a.m. She knew the moment it turned. She had felt it once before with her mother, that shift in the quality of the heat under her hands, something easing, something releasing. She kept working for another 20 minutes before she was certain. Then she straightened up and looked at Wyatt. "It's coming down," she said. Wyatt looked at Lucy's face, at the color in it, which was still poor, but no longer the alarming, hectic brightness of an hour before. At the way the rigidity had left the child's small body, and she had settled into sleep that looked for the first time in hours like actual sleep. He put both hands over his face. Eleanor reached out and put her hand on his arm. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say. She simply held on for a moment. He lowered his hands. His eyes were wet, and he did not try to pretend they weren't. "You saved her," he said. "She saved herself," Eleanor said. "She's strong." "You were here," he said. "If you hadn't been here—" "I was here," Eleanor said, simply. "I am here." He looked at her for a long moment in the gray pre-dawn light, with Lucy breathing quietly between them, and the storm finally beginning to pass outside. "Eleanor," he said. She waited, but he didn't say anything else. He turned back to his daughter and pulled the blanket gently up over her shoulder and touched her hair once briefly, with the careful tenderness of a man who has just been given back something he could not have survived losing. Eleanor went downstairs. Henry was still at the top of the stairs. He stood up when he heard her. She looked up at him. "She's going to be all right." Henry sat back down on the stair and put his forehead on his knees, and his shoulders shook once, twice, and then he pulled himself together with the fierce pride of a 10-year-old boy who does not want to be seen crying. Eleanor climbed the stairs and sat down beside him. He did not move away. After a moment, he leaned very slightly sideways, and his shoulder came to rest against hers, and Eleanor sat with him on the stair at 4 a.m, and neither of them said a single word. It was enough. More than enough. She went to her own room as the sky began to lighten. She did not sleep. She sat in the chair by the east-facing window and looked out at the valley. After the storm, the air washed clean, and the grass dark with water, and the sky beginning to turn that particular pale color that comes before the sun decides to rise. She thought about what Wyatt had said. She saved her life. She was here. She thought about the letter to the Territorial Land Office, sitting on the kitchen table, finished and ready. She thought about Hargrove in his bank in Dust Creek, confident and comfortable, and certain that Wyatt Callahan was too overwhelmed and too alone to catch what he'd done. She thought about Margaret Callahan's sweet peas pushing through the soil in the kitchen garden, and she thought about something Wyatt had said weeks ago the morning on the street outside the general store when she had asked him why her. Because when every one of those men walked away from you, you stood there and kept your dignity. She had kept her dignity. She had kept it in the street and in the boarding house, and in Mabel Hargrove's general store, and in the barn with Wyatt, and on the stairs with Henry, and she had kept it all the way through the longest night of her time in Wyoming. But something had changed in this house. She had arrived to provide a service. She had arrived with her conditions and her suitcase and her $4.62, and her absolute determination not to need anyone's approval. She had not arrived intending to become indispensable to these people. She had not arrived intending to feel what she felt now sitting in this chair in the early morning after saving a child's life, which was, she was honest enough to name it, something close to belonging. Not the desperate borrowed belonging of someone who has been allowed in. Something different. Something she had earned. Something that had grown slowly and honestly from work and time, and showing up in the hard moments without looking for the exit. She had not planned this. But then again, she thought the things that lasted were generally not the things you planned. The sun came up. The valley filled with light. Downstairs, she heard movement. Wyatt up before dawn as always, the pattern of his footsteps that she could read now as easily as she'd read Margaret's handwriting on those seed packets. She heard him check on Lucy. She heard him stand in the hallway for a moment outside the sewing room door. She did not call out. He did not knock, but she heard him stand there for a long moment before he went downstairs, and she understood that he was simply as she was accounting for where they all were, making sure the people who mattered were still where they were supposed to be. She got up. She dressed. She went downstairs and made coffee properly the way it should be made, and when Wyatt came in from the barn at first light, she handed him a cup, and he took it, and their hands were close together for a moment, and neither of them moved away. "Thank you," he said. He had already said it. He said it again. "The letter is on the table," she said. "The one to the land office. It's ready when you are." He picked it up. He read it again standing in the kitchen in the morning light, and when he finished, he set it down and looked at her with the expression of a man who has been shown something he is still learning how to carry. "I'll ride to Turner today," he said. "See if his situation matches." "Good," she said. "And then we send the letter." "And then we send the letter," she agreed. He nodded. He drank his coffee. And the morning went on. Lucy woke at midday weak and hungry, which Eleanor took as the best sign possible. She made broth and sat on the edge of the bed while Lucy drank it, and Lucy, pale and quiet, and more fragile-looking than Eleanor had seen her, looked up at her with those precise dark eyes and said, "You stayed." "I did," Eleanor said. "All night. All night." Lucy was quiet for a moment. Then, Mama used to sit with me when I was sick. Eleanor held very still. Did she? She'd sing sometimes, or talk, just so I knew she was there. Lucy looked at her hands around the cup. I heard your voice, all night. I don't know if you were talking to me or Papa or just, but I heard it. Eleanor did not trust herself to speak for a moment. I was there, she said finally. Lucy looked up at her. Something in the child's careful, precise eyes shifted some last remaining question, some final piece of assessment that had been pending since the first day in the yard, and it settled. I know, Lucy said. She handed Eleanor the empty cup and closed her eyes and went back to sleep. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after. Outside, she could hear Henry in the yard doing his chores, doing them with the particular conscientious energy of a boy who has decided that taking care of things is how you show people what you feel when you don't have the words for it. She could hear Wyatt somewhere in the distance, the sound of a horse being prepared for a ride. She sat on the edge of Lucy's bed in the quiet house and thought that she was a very long way from the woman who had stood in the street in Dust Creek with her suitcase at her feet and listened to three men decide she was not worth choosing. That woman felt very far away now. Not gone, not forgotten, but far away. And this house, this child sleeping this morning, this was where she had arrived. She had not been chosen by the men who promised her a future. She had chosen this herself. And it was, she thought, the best choice she had ever made. Wyatt came back from Turner's place before supper with mud on his boots and something different in the set of his jaw. Eleanor was at the stove when she heard the horse come into the yard. She heard him unsaddle and stable the animal with the quick, efficient movements of a man who has something to say and is containing it until he is inside. She heard his boots on the porch steps. She turned when he came through the door. She knew before he spoke. Turner, he said. Same thing. Penalty clause he didn't know about. Different number, but the same structure. He hung his hat on the hook by the door. And he's not the only one. Turner talked to Alderman the sheep operation up by the creek. Same again. Eleanor set down the spoon she was holding. How many? Turner knows of 3. Could be more. Wyatt sat down at the kitchen table with the heaviness of a man absorbing something larger than he originally calculated. Hargrove's been doing this for years, Eleanor. Waiting for men to fall behind. Adding language that wasn't in the original note. Counting on people being too busy or too proud or too beaten down to check. Or all 3, Eleanor said. Or all 3, he agreed. She sat down across from him. Then it's not just your fight. No. That changes the lawyer calculation, she said. 3 affected parties seeking legal remedy against a fraudulent banking practice is a substantially different proposition than one rancher disputing a single note. A territorial attorney sees 3 clients and a pattern of fraud. That's a case worth taking. That's potentially a case worth pursuing on contingency. Wyatt looked at her. You know a territorial attorney. I know how to write a letter that will make one want to respond, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, he had stopped being surprised by her several weeks ago, which she took as a compliment, more profound than anything he might have actually said. It was closer to relief. The particular relief of a man who has been carrying something alone for so long that the simple act of someone saying, I'll carry it with you, feels like setting down a weight he'd forgotten, was extraordinary. Turner and Alderman, Eleanor said. Would they be willing to put their names to a formal complaint? Turner will. He's angry enough. Wyatt thought about it. Alderman is more cautious. He doesn't want trouble. He already has trouble, Eleanor said. He just doesn't know it's trouble until it takes his land. Wyatt nodded slowly. I'll talk to him again. I'll have a letter drafted tonight, Eleanor said. To an attorney in Cheyenne. I want you to read it before I send it. She paused. There are 2 separate arguments here. One is the fraudulent modification of the loan terms. The other is the pattern, if Hargrove has done this systematically, that moves it from a contractual dispute to something closer to criminal fraud. A good attorney will see both. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Where did you learn all this? She almost said nowhere, the way Henry had said nowhere about the carving. Instead, she said the true thing. My father died owing money to men who knew exactly what the document said and counted on him not knowing. I decided I would know. Wyatt looked at her steadily. She could see him revising not his opinion of her, which had been in steady revision since the first morning, but his understanding of how she had become who she was. What it had cost. I'm sorry, he said. About your father. It was a long time ago, she said. But it's why I checked your letter line by line the moment I saw it. She got up and went back to the stove because supper still needed finishing, and Lucy was still recovering upstairs, and the practical world had a way of insisting on itself regardless of what larger dramas were in motion. Wyatt sat at the table, and she could feel him thinking he was not a man whose mind ever stopped. She had learned that it was simply that his thinking was mostly interior, contained behind that steady exterior. After a moment, he said, Eleanor. What you did the other night, with Lucy. She did not turn around. We've talked about it. I need to say it again, he said. I need to say it clearly. A pause. I don't know what I would have done. If you hadn't been here, I don't know how I would have gotten through that night. She turned then. He was looking at her with the directness that was characteristic of him, no hedging, no decoration, just the thing itself laid out plainly. You would have gotten through it, she said. You're not a man who doesn't get through things. Maybe, he said. But I wouldn't have known what to do. And she... He stopped. The muscle in his jaw worked briefly. She's here because of you. She's here because she's strong, Eleanor said. The same reason you're still on this land. The same reason Henry gets up every morning and does his chores and carves his horses and doesn't give up. You're all strong. I was here. Stop doing that, he said quietly. She looked at him. Doing what? Making yourself smaller than you are, he said. You do it when you talk about yourself. You stop short. Like you're worried that claiming your own worth is something you don't have the right to. He held her gaze. You have the right. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Eleanor felt something move through her that she did not immediately have a name for. It was not embarrassment, though it was adjacent to it. It was the feeling of being seen in a way that required you to see yourself, and finding that the version being reflected back was larger and more capable than the one you had grown accustomed to inhabiting. All right, she said finally. All right, he said. She turned back to the stove. But the thing he had said stayed with her, settled into her, and did not leave. Lucy came downstairs for supper for the first time since the fever. Moving carefully, still pale, but with the returning brightness in her eyes that Eleanor had been watching for, with the patient attention of someone who knows exactly what recovery looks like. She sat down at the table and looked at her supper, and then looked at Eleanor. You made the good biscuits, she said. You needed them, Eleanor said. Lucy looked at her with the full weight of her 8-year-old assessment. Henry said you sat on the stairs with him all night. Henry across the table went very still in the way of a boy who did not know this information was being shared. For a while, Eleanor said. He doesn't let people do that, Lucy said with the frank informational tone of a child reporting a fact. Sit with him. He's been like that since Mama died. He sits by himself. Henry's ears had gone red. Lucy, he said. It's true, Lucy said. Lucy, he said again with considerable feeling. I'm just saying she's special, Lucy said with the unassailable logic of a child who believes she is paying a compliment and cannot understand why anyone would object. Eleanor looked at Henry. His ears were still red, but he had stopped trying to object, which was its own kind of statement. He picked up his fork and applied himself to his supper with great concentration. Wyatt looked at his coffee cup. Eleanor passed the biscuits. It was the most domestic moment she had experienced since arriving in Wyoming, and it landed on her with the particular weight of things that are ordinary and therefore extraordinary. 3 days later, Wyatt came back from talking to Alderman. He came in the front door and found Eleanor at the kitchen table writing the letter to the Cheyenne attorney, was in its 4th draft. Each version sharper and more precisely argued than the last, and he sat down across from her and said, Alderman's in, and he knows of 2 more, Pemberton and the Hatch widow. Eleanor set down her pen. 5. 5 confirmed, possibly more if word gets around. Then the letter changes, she said. I need to redraft it. She pulled a fresh sheet toward her. 5 parties alleging a systematic pattern of fraudulent note modification by a single bank officer constitutes a significantly stronger case. An attorney looking at this sees not just damages, but precedent. Territorial newspapers would be interested in this kind of case. Wyatt leaned back in his chair and looked at her with a quality of attention that she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at things he valued. Steadily, without hurry. You're going to take apart everything Hargrove built, he said. I'm going to help 5 families keep their land, Eleanor said. If that takes apart what Hargrove built, that's his own doing. The letter went out the following week. Eleanor read it aloud to Wyatt the evening before they sent it, sitting at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, and he listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which she had learned was his way of giving something his complete attention. When she finished, he said, "It's good." "It's better than good," she said, because he had told her not to make herself smaller, and she had decided to take that seriously. He looked at her with something in his eyes that was not quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. "It's better than good," he agreed. The response came from Cheyenne in 12 days. A man named Callum Reed, territorial attorney, who wrote in a style that was brisk and intelligent and told Eleanor within 3 sentences that he was exactly the right person for this. He wrote encountered Hargrove's name in connection with a similar situation 2 years prior that had not been pursued. He was very interested in what Eleanor's letter described. He would be in Dust Creek within the month. Wyatt read Reed's letter standing up. He read it twice. Then he set it on the table. "He's coming," he said. "He's coming," Eleanor confirmed. Wyatt looked at her across the table. "Hargrove doesn't know what's about to happen." "No," Eleanor said. "He doesn't." What happened next was the thing she had not anticipated. 3 days before Reed was due to arrive, Hargrove came to the ranch. Not alone. He brought a man with him she didn't recognize, broad, with the particular blankness of expression that belongs to men employed specifically for presence rather than conversation. They rode into the yard mid-morning while Wyatt was out checking the fence line on the north pasture, and Eleanor was alone in the house with Lucy. She heard the horses and came to the door. Hargrove had the prosperous, settled look of a man who expects his arrival to produce a particular effect. He looked at Eleanor with the mild, dismissive assessment of a man who sees an employee at a doorway and feels no need to revise his assessment of the situation. "I'm looking for Callahan," he said. "He's not here at present," Eleanor said. "And you are Eleanor Whitfield. I manage the household." Hargrove looked at her for a moment, with the particular look of a man filing information away. "When did you expect him back?" "I couldn't say." He studied her. She met his eyes without difficulty. She had been looked at by men who wanted to make her feel small for most of her adult life, and she had developed over years of practice the ability to receive that kind of look without letting it land. "I've heard," Hargrove said pleasantly, "that Callahan has been making inquiries about his loan documentation." "I really couldn't say," Eleanor said. "It would be unfortunate," Hargrove said in the same pleasant tone, "if those inquiries complicated what has been until now a manageable situation. Banks have options, Miss Whitfield, when borrowers become difficult." She looked at him for a moment. She said clearly, and without any heat at all, "Mr. Hargrove, I want you to know that I have documented the discrepancy between the original note Mr. Callahan signed and the penalty clause you inserted into your demand letter. I have also documented similar discrepancies in the loan documentation of 4 other area landowners. I have communicated all of this to a territorial attorney in Cheyenne, who will be in Dust Creek within the week. That documentation is in multiple locations, so the inconvenience of anything happening to this particular house would be just that, an inconvenience, and would not affect the proceedings." Hargrove looked at her. The pleasant expression did not disappear immediately. It took a moment. She could see him processing, recalculating, and then it faded, and what was underneath it was not anger exactly, but the particular cold reassessment of a man who has walked into a room expecting it to be empty and found it occupied. "You're very confident," he said. "I'm very accurate," she said. He sat on his horse and looked at her for a moment longer. The large, quiet man beside him had not moved or changed expression throughout the entire exchange. "Good day, Miss Whitfield," Hargrove said finally. "Good day, Mr. Hargrove," she said. She stood in the doorway and watched them ride out of the yard. Then she went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table and put both hands flat on the surface and breathed. Her hands were completely steady. She noted this with satisfaction. Lucy appeared at the top of the stairs. "Who was that?" "A man with a problem he's only beginning to understand," Eleanor said. "Are we okay?" Lucy asked. "Yes," Eleanor said. "We are very okay." She heard Wyatt's horse in the yard 20 minutes later, and when he came through the door, she told him everything. She told it plainly in sequence, and she watched his expression move through several things. Anger at Hargrove, something colder at the image of Hargrove sitting on his horse in the yard with Eleanor alone in the house, and then something else. Something that was harder to name when she got to the part where she had told Hargrove about the documentation and the attorney and the multiple locations. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You told him it was in multiple locations," he said. "It is," Eleanor said. "I sent copies to Turner and Alderman, and I sent a copy to Mrs. Dolan at the boarding house." Wyatt looked at her. "She was reliable," Eleanor said. "She's been in this town 20 years. She knows everyone. And she doesn't like Hargrove. I gathered that from the first night." Wyatt sat down. He rubbed his hand over his face. Then he said, "Did he frighten you?" "No," she said. "Then, yes, a little. Not enough to matter." He looked at her with the steadiness that was his characteristic way of looking at things he took seriously. "That's the most honest answer you've given me about yourself since you got here." She almost deflected. She caught herself doing it and stopped. "I've been practicing," she said. He almost smiled. She was learning to read the almost smiles, which were more frequent than the actual ones, and in some ways more significant, because they were less controlled. Callum Reed arrived on a Thursday, 11 days after his letter. Howe was a compact man of perhaps 50, with quick eyes and the manner of someone who has spent decades in rooms where people are lying and has become very good at identifying exactly where. He shook Eleanor's hand first before Wyatt's, because she had been the one who wrote the letter, and in that handshake she felt the respect of a professional who has read work of a certain quality and adjusted his expectations of the person who produced it. "Your letter was excellent," he told her. "The most clearly documented case I've seen in 15 years of territorial practice." "Thank you," she said, and did not qualify it. Reed spent 2 days in Dust Creek. He met with Wyatt and Turner and Alderman and Pemberton and the Hatch widow. He examined original loan documents and demand letters and Eleanor's side-by-side comparisons of the discrepant clauses. He spoke to 3 additional ranchers who came forward once word spread that something was happening. On the second evening, Reed sat at the kitchen table with Wyatt and Eleanor and laid out what he had. 8 confirmed cases, he said. Possibly more. The modification pattern is identical across all of them, which means this wasn't carelessness. This was systematic. He looked at Eleanor. "Your documentation of the interest rate discrepancy is the cornerstone of the case. Without that, we have complaints. With it, we have evidence." "What happens to Hargrove?" Wyatt asked. "He loses his banking charter at minimum," Reed said. "Criminal fraud charges are likely. The territorial court takes this kind of thing seriously. Banking fraud that strips landowners of property undermines everything the territory is trying to build. They'll want to make an example." He paused. "The affected landowners will likely see their loan balances recalculated at the correct rate. Several of you may find you're not actually behind on payments at all once the fraudulent charges are removed." Wyatt was still. "Not behind," he said. "Likely not," Reed said. "I'll know more precisely when I've done the full calculation. But your case, Callahan, you're close to the line. Once Hargrove's additions are removed, you may be well within the original terms." The kitchen was quiet. Eleanor looked at Wyatt. He was staring at the table. She could see him absorbing this, not just the financial relief, which was enormous, but the weight of what it meant. He had spent months believing he was losing this land. Months carrying that alongside everything else, the children, the ranch, the grief that was always present. Months of that specific helpless fear of a man who has worked for something his whole life and is watching it be taken by something he cannot fight with his hands. And now, "The land is safe," he said. Not a question. "I believe so," Reed said. "Yes." Wyatt nodded. "Once." Then he put both hands on the table and stood up and said, "Excuse me for a moment," in a voice that was very controlled, and walked out the back door. Eleanor looked at Reed. "Give him a minute," she said. Reed nodded. He packed his papers with the efficient, respectful movements of a man who has delivered good news in difficult situations before and knows how to give people space to receive it. Eleanor sat at the table and listened to the quiet of the yard outside. After a few minutes, she went to the back door and looked out. Wyatt was standing in the yard with his back to the house. The evening was clear, and the first stars were showing, and the land was doing its enormous, indifferent, beautiful thing all around him. She did not go to him. She stood in the doorway. After a moment, he turned. He looked at her across the yard. She did not say anything. She simply looked back. He crossed the yard. He came up to the step where she was standing, which put them nearly at eye level, and he looked at her with the expression she had been seeing more and more of over recent weeks, the one she had struggled to name, and had finally quietly to herself named. "Eleanor," he said. "I know," she said. "I haven't said it." "I know that too," she said. I was quiet for a moment. She could see him organizing himself, this man who was always deliberate, always careful, always making sure he meant what he said before he said it. "I told you when you first came," he said, "that I wanted someone who didn't fall apart when things went wrong." "You did," she said. "I didn't know then," he said, "that what I was really looking for was someone who could look at a thing that was already falling apart and figure out how to hold it together." He paused. "That's different. It's harder. And it takes a particular kind of person." "It takes someone who's had practice," Eleanor said. "Yeah," he said. "But Eleanor, it takes someone who chooses to," he said. "You didn't have to stay, after the rejection, after Hargrove showed up after that night with Lucy. Every one of those things was a reason to go. You stayed." "I chose this," she said. "From the beginning. I chose this." He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically. The way you take hold of something you've been wanting to reach for and have finally given yourself permission. His hand was large and calloused and warm, and she felt the realness of it, the specific, undeniable physical reality, with a clarity that surprised her. "I'd like to give you a reason to keep choosing it," he said. "If you'd let me." She looked at him in the evening light. She thought about Boston, about the narrow room and the seamstress shop and the $4.62 and the three men who looked at her and found her wanting. She thought about the east-facing window and the sweet peas and Henry's carved horses and Lucy's hand in hers. She thought about a man who had said, "You don't always have to be fine, and stop making yourself smaller than you are," and she would have liked you and meant every word. "I'm going to have conditions," she said. The almost smile appeared. "I know," he said. "I'm not going to give up the bookkeeping," she said. "I've already had 3 people ask me to look at their loan documents, and I intend to say yes." "Good," he said. "And I'm writing to the Cheyenne Library about harder books for Lucy. She's bored with what the school provides, and it's going to make her difficult." "She's already difficult," he said. "She's extraordinary," Eleanor said. "There's a difference." She paused. "And Henry's carvings, Reed mentioned that there are merchants in Cheyenne who handle craft goods. I want to write to them." "Eleanor," Wyatt said, and the way he said her name was different from every previous time. Fuller, warmer, more settled. The way you say the name of something you are sure of. "What?" she said. "Are those all the conditions?" She thought about it. "For now." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Well, I accept them." And standing there in the yard in the early evening with the stars coming out and the land quiet all around them, and Reed inside packing his papers, and Lucy recovered, and Henry in the shed, probably carving something extraordinary. Wyatt Callahan held Eleanor Whitfield's hand, and she let him, and it was the simplest and most complete moment she had experienced in as long as she could remember. She had not been chosen by the men who promised her a future. She had arrived in Wyoming with nothing, and she had built something not from luck, not from rescue, but from work and attention, and the refusal to be less than what she was. And standing here now, she thought that this was what the women in the matrimonial advertisements never wrote about. They wrote about comfort and security and a good man. They did not write about the particular quality of being known. Being seen not as a category, not as the delicate woman, or the sturdy woman, or the educated woman, or the unwanted woman, but as the specific, particular, unrepeatable person you actually were. Wyatt knew who she was. He had watched her and listened, and paid attention with the unhurried precision that was his nature, and he knew who she was. That was rarer than any of the things she had been looking for. Inside the house, she heard Lucy's voice calling down the stairs, for no particular reason, the way Lucy sometimes did in the evenings, just to confirm that the people she loved were still in earshot. "Papa?" Wyatt turned toward the house. "Yeah, I'm here." "Is Miss Whitfield there?" He looked at Eleanor. "I'm here," Eleanor called. A pause. Then, "Good," Lucy said in the tone of someone confirming that the world is correctly ordered. "Supper's going to be cold." "I'll warm it," Eleanor said. She went inside. She went to the stove and she warmed supper, and she set it on the table, and she called Henry in from the shed, and when they sat down, all four of them, the way they always sat now, Wyatt at the head and the children on one side, and Eleanor across from them, it was the most ordinary thing in the world. And that she thought was exactly right. The ordinary was what she had been traveling toward all along. She had just not known that ordinary could feel like this, like something earned, something real, something built by hand from the ground up by a woman who refused to be less than she was. She passed the bread. Henry took it first, and then passed it to Lucy, and said in the tone he used when he was trying to sound indifferent and failing, "Reed said there's a merchant in Cheyenne who buys craft goods." "He did," Eleanor said. "What kind of merchant?" "The kind who might be very interested in carved horses," she said. Henry looked at his plate. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was trying not to show how much something mattered. "Huh," he said. But he ate 2 helpings of supper, and when he went upstairs that night, he said without turning around, "Good night, Miss Whitfield." It was the first time he had said it. "Good night, Henry," she said. She stood in the kitchen after everyone had gone up and listened to the house settle around her. 11 weeks ago she had stepped off a stagecoach with a suitcase and $4.62 and a last remnant of something she had almost stopped calling hope. She looked around the kitchen she had cleaned and organized and made into a place where things happened, where meals were made, and problems were solved, and children were fed, and hard truths were spoken, and plans were laid, and a family had slowly, imperfectly, stubbornly come back to life. She blew out the lamp. She went upstairs. And tomorrow she thought there was work to do. There was always work to do. That was the best thing she knew about her life now. The letter from Cheyenne arrived on a Monday. Eleanor was at the kitchen table working through the Hatch widow's loan documents when she heard the sound of a rider in the yard. She did not look up immediately. Riders came and went with more regularity. Now that word had spread about what was happening with Hargrove's bank, and she had learned to distinguish between the arrivals that required her immediate attention and the ones that could wait until she had finished her current thought. This one required her immediate attention. Wyatt came through the door holding the envelope, and she knew from the way he was holding it carefully with both hands, the way you carry something you are afraid to drop, that it was from Reed. "Open it," she said. He set it on the table in front of her. She looked at him. He nodded. She opened it. Reed's handwriting was as brisk and efficient as his speech. She read the letter once through fast, and then went back and read the key paragraph again slowly, making sure she had the precise meaning of every word. Then she set it down. "Well," Wyatt said. "The Territorial Court reviewed the documentation," she said. "They've issued a formal injunction against Hargrove's bank. All loan modifications made without explicit borrower acknowledgement are void. The affected accounts will be recalculated at original terms." She looked up. "And the territorial prosecutor is pursuing criminal fraud charges." The kitchen was very quiet. "It's done," Wyatt said. The formal proceedings will take time, Eleanor said. Courts always take time. But the outcome, yes. For all practical purposes, it's done. Wyatt sat down. He sat down the way a man sits when he has been standing for a very long time, and his legs have finally decided they are finished with it. He put both elbows on the table and both hands over his face, and he stayed that way for a long moment. Eleanor waited. When he lowered his hands, his eyes were clear, but the skin around them was tight in the way of a man who has just released something he has been holding at great cost for a very long time. "How much do we owe Reed?" he said. "He's billing on contingency from the recovered damages," Eleanor said. "You won't owe him out of pocket." Wyatt looked at her. "You arranged that." "I suggested it in the initial letter," she said. He agreed it was appropriate given the circumstances. Howe was quiet for a moment. Then, with the particular simplicity of a man who means exactly what he says, "I don't know what I'd have done without you." "You would have found a way," she said. "Eventually." "Eleanor." He said her name in the tone he had developed over recent weeks, the tone that meant, "Stop deflecting. I am talking to you directly, receive it." "I would have lost this land. I would have lost it and taken my children somewhere and started over, and it would have broken something in me that I don't think would have healed." He paused. "You know that." She did know it. She had known it since the night in the barn when he told her how far behind he was. She had understood from the beginning that the stakes were exactly that high. "Then I'm glad I was here," she said. And this time she did not qualify it. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. They sat like that for a moment, the two of them, at the kitchen table, with Reed's letter between them, and the land outside the window, and the whole business of the future arranged in front of them, like a thing to be walked into, rather than a thing to be feared. "I have something to ask you," he said. "You've been working up to it for 3 days," she said. He looked at her. "You noticed." "I notice everything," she said. "You know that." The almost smile appeared. Then it became an actual smile, rare and complete, and it changed his face in the way that his actual smiles always did, made him look younger and less burdened, and entirely himself. "Marry me," he said. Not will you, or would you, or I was wondering if perhaps. Just the thing itself, direct and undecorated the way he did everything that mattered. Eleanor looked at him across the table. She thought briefly about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach 4 months ago in this same town, the woman with 1 suitcase and $4.62, and the specific kind of exhausted pride that comes from being underestimated so consistently that you begin to organize your entire life around proving the underestimators wrong. That woman had not been looking for this, but that woman had been wrong about a great many things, and Eleanor had made a practice of updating her positions when the evidence required it. "I have conditions," she said. "You always have conditions," he said. "Tell me." "I keep my own name professionally," she said. "When I'm working on documents and accounts, people know Eleanor Whitfield's work now. I'm not starting over." "Done," he said. "I'm going to continue helping the other affected families. Turner Alderman, the Hatch widow. It may take time away from the household some days." "Done," he said. "Lucy gets the books from Cheyenne," she said. "All of them, as many as she wants. I don't care what it costs." "Eleanor," he said. "I wasn't going to argue any of these." "I know," she said. "I'm telling you anyway, so it's clear from the beginning." "Clear," he said. "From the beginning, yes to all of it." He paused. "Is that a yes?" She looked at him. This man who had left a letter under a boarding house door and offered her a room and fair wages and the word respect, and meant every word of it. This man who had noticed her dignity in a street full of people looking at her failure. This man who sat beside her in the dark and said, "You don't always have to be fine." "Yes," she said. He stood up and came around the table, and when he took her hands and pulled her to her feet, she stood and looked at him and felt the reality of it. Not the romantic version, not the idealized version, but the actual specific hard-won version of two people who had been through enough together to know exactly what they were choosing. "I should tell the children," she said. "They already know," he said. She stared at him. "You told them." "Lucy has known for 2 weeks," he said. "I don't know how. She just She looked at me one morning at breakfast and said, "You're going to ask her soon, aren't you?" And I said I was planning to, and she said good, because she was tired of waiting. Eleanor put her hand over her mouth. "Henry," Wyatt said, took slightly longer. He was quiet about it for a day, and then he came to me in the barn and said. He paused, and his voice was careful in the way of a man quoting something he has committed exactly to memory. He said, "She's the only person outside this family who's ever treated my horses like they matter, so I think you should ask her." Eleanor sat back down. She needed to sit down. "He said that," she said. "He said that," Wyatt confirmed. She put both hands flat on the table and breathed. She was not going to cry. She had made a decision, years ago, about crying in front of people, and she was not revising it now. She breathed and held herself steady, and after a moment, she was fine, or close enough to fine, that it made no practical difference. "All right," she said. "All right," Wyatt said. "All right," she said again more firmly, and stood up. "Somebody needs to start supper." He laughed. A real one, full and unguarded, the kind she had been hearing more of lately, and still found slightly startling each time because of how completely it transformed him. She stood in her kitchen and listened to Wyatt Callahan laugh, and thought that this sound alone was worth everything the last 4 months had cost her. The news reached Dust Creek before Eleanor and Wyatt had even discussed the details of the wedding, which was the nature of small towns, and which Eleanor had entirely anticipated. Mrs. Dolan was the first to come to the ranch. She arrived on a Tuesday with a jar of preserved peaches, and the frank approving expression of a woman whose judgment has been confirmed. "I told Mabel Hargrove," Mrs. Dolan said, sitting at Eleanor's kitchen table with her hands around a cup of properly made coffee, "that the day you walked out of my boarding house with your suitcase was the day Dust Creek got considerably more interesting." "What did Mrs. Hargrove say?" Eleanor asked. "She said she'd always thought highly of you," Mrs. Dolan said, with the dry precision of a woman who remembers every conversation exactly as it happened. Eleanor poured more coffee. "Of course she did." Mrs. Dolan looked at her with something close to admiration. "What are you going to do about the bank now that Hargrove's done?" "The territorial court will appoint a receiver," Eleanor said. "In the meantime, Reed has filed a motion to freeze any further collection actions. The affected landowners should be receiving formal notices within the month." She set the coffee pot down. "The bank itself may be sold or restructured. There are already inquiries from Cheyenne interests." Mrs. Dolan looked at her for a moment. "You know more about what happens to that bank than most people in this town." "I've been paying attention," Eleanor said. "You've been doing considerably more than that," Mrs. Dolan said. She paused. "Hargrove left town last week. Did you hear?" Eleanor had not heard. She absorbed this piece of information with the stillness of someone confirming something they had expected without being certain of. "His wife?" she asked. "Stayed," Mrs. Dolan said. "Mabel Hargrove is not a woman who leaves when things get difficult." A pause. "I think you have more in common with her than either of you would enjoy hearing." Eleanor thought about Mabel Hargrove standing in the general store, telling her that a single woman living on a widower's property was a subject of considerable local commentary. She thought about Mabel saying she had always believed a woman could make her own way if she was determined. "I'll go see her," Eleanor said. Mrs. Dolan looked at her. "Will you?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "She's going to have a difficult winter, and she's too proud to ask anyone for anything. I know what that's like." Mrs. Dolan set down her coffee cup. She looked at Eleanor with the full, frank assessment of a woman who has been observing people for 60 years and rarely revises her opinions once formed. "You are," she said, "not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Eleanor asked. "Not this," Mrs. Dolan said simply. The Hargrove visit happened on a Thursday. Eleanor drove the small wagon into town alone, the way she often did now, and went to the house behind the bank. The banker's house, which was the finest in Dust Creek, and which had a quality of embattled dignity about it, now the way a thing looks when its external justification has been removed and only the thing itself remains. Mabel Hargrove answered the door herself. She looked at Eleanor for a long moment. "Miss Whitfield," she said. "Mrs. Callahan soon," Eleanor said. "May I come in?" Another pause. Then Mabel stepped back and let her in. They sat in the front parlor, and Eleanor did not waste either of their time with preamble. "I know your situation is difficult," she said. "I want you to know that the legal actions against your husband are not actions against you. Your personal assets, separate from the bank holdings, should not be affected." Mabel looked at her with the expression of a woman who is deciding whether to accept something or defend against it. "You came here to tell me that," she said. "I came here to tell you that," Eleanor confirmed, "and also to tell you that if you need someone to look at your personal financial documents to confirm your position, I'm willing to do that." Mabel was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Why?" "Because you're going to have a difficult time and you won't ask for help," Eleanor said. "And I've been in that position, and I know how much worse it is than it needs to be." Mabel Hargrove looked at her across the parlor of the finest house in Dust Creek, and something shifted in her expression, the careful armored competence giving way to something underneath it that was much more human and much more tired. "I didn't know what he was doing," she said. "I want you to know that." "I believe you," Eleanor said. "I knew he was aggressive in his business practices. I told myself it was simply how banking worked." She paused. "I should have looked more closely." "Yes," Eleanor said simply. She did not soften it because Mabel Hargrove was not a woman who needed to be protected from truth. "But that's done. What matters now is what comes next." Mabel was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're a remarkable woman, Miss Whitfield." "Eleanor," she said. "Eleanor." Mabel looked at her. "I owe you an apology, from the first day." "You do," Eleanor said. "But I appreciate that you're making it." They sat together for another hour, and when Eleanor left, she had a list of Mabel's personal financial documentation that she had agreed to review, and Mabel Hargrove had the particular expression of a woman who has been given something unexpected and is still deciding how to carry it. It was the first week of October when the hearing happened. The territorial court sent a representative to Dust Creek, a magistrate named Fowler Compact and Precise, who set up in the town hall and conducted his proceedings with brisk efficiency. Eleanor sat beside Reed at the table for the affected landowner's side, which caused a certain amount of commentary in the public gallery because a woman sitting at the legal table was not a common sight in Dust Creek in 1885. She ignored the commentary. She had documents to organize. Wyatt sat in the gallery with Turner and Alderman and Pemberton. Henry had asked to come. Wyatt had said yes because Henry was 10 years old, and it was time he understood that there were ways of fighting that did not require fists. Lucy had stayed home on the condition that Eleanor would tell her everything. The hearing lasted most of the day. The fraudulent modifications were entered into evidence. Reed argued the case with the clean, systematic precision that had made Eleanor trust him from his first letter. Hargrove's attorney, brought in from Laramie, expensive, outmatched, objected on procedural grounds at several points, and was overruled each time. At 2 in the afternoon, Magistrate Fowler called a brief recess. At 3, he rendered his decision. The fraudulent clauses were formally voided. All 8 affected loans were to be recalculated at original terms. The matter of criminal fraud charges was referred to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for formal proceedings. The bank's operational license was suspended pending review. The gallery was not quiet when Fowler finished. Wyatt found Eleanor afterward outside the town hall in the street that 4 months ago had been the street where she stood with her suitcase at her feet and listened to 3 men decide she wasn't worth choosing. He did not say anything. He simply stood in front of her and looked at her. "It's done," she said. "Yeah," he said. Henry was beside him, standing straight, watching Eleanor with the expression he'd developed over recent weeks, the one that had replaced the armored, guarded look and contained something more open and more complicated and more his own. "Reed says you're the one who cracked it open," Henry said. "The interest clause." "Reed is being generous," Eleanor said. "Reed is being accurate," Henry said. He said it with the particular firmness of a boy who has decided something and is saying it exactly once. Eleanor looked at him. He met her eyes. Between them passed the specific private understanding of 2 people who have sat on a staircase in the dark in the worst hours of a bad night, and who do not need to say everything out loud because some things are already settled. "Thank you, Henry," she said. He nodded. Then, in the tone of a boy, moving efficiently past a moment of feeling before it could get the better of him. Lucy's going to be furious she missed this. She'll get her account, Eleanor said. I promised. She'll want every detail, he said. She'll get every detail, Eleanor said. Twice. Henry almost smiled. It was his father's almost smile. She had noticed the same location on his face, the same quality of being more significant than the full version. He turned and went to find Turner's son, who was his age, and who he had been in careful provisional conversation with for 3 weeks, the kind of friendship that forms slowly between boys who are both too proud to admit they want it. Wyatt watched him go. He's going to be all right, Wyatt said. He's going to be extraordinary, Eleanor said. The carvings Reed mentioned the Cheyenne merchant again this morning. There's genuine interest. I know, Wyatt said. Henry's been up late 3 nights in a row working on a set. Did you tell him to sleep? I told him twice. The third time I decided that a boy who loses sleep over his work is a boy who loves his work, and that's not something you interrupt. Eleanor looked at him. That, she said, is exactly right. He put his arm around her shoulders, easy and natural, the way you put your arm around something you are sure of. They stood together in the main street of Dust Creek, and the town moved around them. People coming out of the town hall, voices and commentary, and the general noise of a small community processing a significant day. Samuel Carter passed them. He tipped his hat to Eleanor with the expression of a man who has made his peace with being wrong. Thomas Reed was further down the street talking to someone, and he looked up and nodded with a similar quality of chastened acknowledgement. Caleb Morris, she had heard, had moved on from Dust Creek in the summer. She wished him no particular ill. She did not think about him much. She thought instead about the woman she had been when she stepped off that stagecoach, the woman who pressed her dress in the middle of the night at a way station because she wanted to look like someone worth choosing. The woman who counted out $4.62 and made a plan in a narrow boarding house room while strangers whispered on the street outside. She had wanted then to be chosen. She understood now that she had been choosing all along. Every decision from the moment she stepped off of that coach to stay, to take the job, to plant the seeds, to check the documents, to write the letter, to stand in her doorway and face down a fraudulent banker without flinching. Every one of those had been her own. Nobody had rescued her. She had built this. The wedding was on the last Saturday of October as the leaves were turning. It was small. Eleanor had not wanted spectacle, and Wyatt had not offered any. The minister from the church with the slightly tilted cross. Mrs. Dolan, who had served in her way as the first person in Dust Creek to treat Eleanor with simple human respect, and who stood in the front with the particular expression of a woman attending an outcome she considers correct. Turner and his wife. Alderman. Reed, who had made the journey from Cheyenne because he said he had found in this case something he had not encountered in 15 years of territorial practice, which was a situation that was entirely just, and he liked to see just situations through to their conclusions. Henry stood beside his father. He had carved 2 small figures in the days before the wedding, a man and a woman both standing straight, the woman's chin slightly raised. He pressed them into Eleanor's hand the morning of the ceremony without explanation. She looked at them for a long moment. She looked at him. "They're for you," he said. "Both of them." She closed her hand around them. "Thank you, Henry." He looked away. His ears went red. He went to stand by his father. Lucy stood beside Eleanor. She had insisted on this with the absolute non-negotiable certainty that was her characteristic mode when she had decided something. She held Eleanor's hand through most of the ceremony, and when the minister asked if anyone had cause to object, she looked around the room with an expression so specifically warning that Turner later told Wyatt it was the most effective deterrent he'd ever seen. Eleanor looked at Wyatt when the minister asked the question that mattered, and Wyatt looked at her, and in his face was everything. He was the steadiness, the honesty, the quality of attention that she had come to rely on more than she had expected to rely on anything. And behind all of it, the particular warmth that was only there when he looked at her, that had been growing in visibility since the first morning in the street outside the general store, and was now simply present plainly and completely, like something that had always been on its way. She said yes. He said yes. It was done. Afterward, in the small gathering at the ranch, Mrs. Dolan's preserved peaches on the table, Turner's wife's cornbread, the good coffee that Eleanor always made. Henry disappeared for 20 minutes and came back with a carved horse that was the finest thing he had made so far, which he set in the center of the table and said, "For the house," and then went to get more cornbread. Lucy fell asleep in her chair by 8 o'clock, and Wyatt carried her upstairs, and when he came back down, he found Eleanor standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the dark valley, and he came and stood behind her, and she leaned back slightly and felt the solidity of him. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking about Margaret's sweet peas," she said. "They'll come back next spring, stronger now that the roots are established." Howe was quiet for a moment. "She would have wanted that," he said. "I know," Eleanor said. "I've been tending them like I understood that." He put his arms around her, and she put her hands over his, and they stood at the window in the kitchen of the house that she had cleaned and repaired and made into a home, and the land outside was enormous and dark and very still. "Wyatt," she said. I want you to know something." "Tell me." "I didn't come here to be saved," she said. "I came here to find a place where I could be what I actually am. And I found it." She paused. "I need you to know that I'm not here because I had nowhere else to go. I'm here because this is where I want to be. That's different." He was quiet for a moment. His arms tightened slightly. "I know," he said. "I've known that for a long time. Probably since the morning you drove into town alone and told Hargrove his documentation was fraudulent to his face without raising your voice." "Before that," she said. "Probably before that," he agreed. She smiled. He could not see it, but she thought he could feel it, the way a person can feel the quality of another person's breathing change when they smile. "Good night, Mrs. Callahan," he said. She turned around and looked at him. "Good night, Wyatt," she said, years later. People in Dust Creek still remembered the summer of 1885 and the woman who arrived on the stage as the bride nobody wanted. They told the story in different ways, depending on who was telling it. Some emphasized the legal case which had made the territorial papers and had produced in its wake banking reforms that protected landowners across 3 territories. Some emphasized the children and how Henry Callahan's carvings had found their way to merchants in Cheyenne and Denver, and eventually to a gallery in San Francisco that described them as extraordinary examples of self-taught Western craft. Some talked about Lucy, who grew up to study law in the territory's first formal program that accepted women who told every class she ever taught that she had learned to read properly from a woman who refused to give her easy books. And some simply said, there was a woman who came out here with nothing and she built something that lasted. That was the truest version. Eleanor Callahan built it with her own hands. With her intelligence and her refusal and her willingness to do the hard thing in the hard moment without looking for the exit. She built it in the kitchen garden and at the legal table and on the staircase in the dark and in the east-facing room where the morning light came first. She had arrived looking to be chosen. She had learned in Wyoming that she had always been the one doing the choosing. And everything she chose, the land, the children, the man, the work, the life she chose completely with her whole self, and she never once looked back at the stagecoach that had brought her here and wished she had stayed on it. She had not come to Dust Creek to be rescued. She had come to find out what she was capable of, and what she was capable of, it turned out, was everything.